Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get signed in. While we're waiting to get started, I'll do quick introductions and take care of a few housekeeping items. I'm Jessie Beeringer, Head of Marketing for 3D Group, and I'll be facilitating our session today. Joining me to discuss 360 feedback is 3D Group Senior Consultant Charles Gerhold. Charles has over 20 years of consulting and business experience, serving clients from a wide variety of industries across North America, Latin America, and Europe. As a consultant, his work is focused on leadership development, organizational effectiveness, executive coaching, strategic HR alignment, and succession management. Charles has also held internal business unit leadership and human resources roles, including leading the North American human capital consulting business for Hudson Consulting and leading global talent management and acquisition for Scott's Miracle-Gro. Charles has his master's in IO psychology from the University of Tulsa. So please feel free to ask questions throughout the presentation using the chat box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We'll answer as many as we can at the end. Thank you all for joining us today for pre- and post-tests with 360 feedback, best practices for retesting after leadership development and coaching. Charles, I'll hand it over to you to get started.
Thanks, Jessie. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Today, we're going to be talking about using 360-degree feedback for pre- and post-assessment of leadership behavior change and development over time. 3D Group, we do use 360s in this way. We've had great success in working with leaders to assess behavior change over time using 360 feedbacks. But we also know that accurate interpretation of change over time requires care. Today, we're going to be covering some really important issues around the pros and cons of using 360-degree feedback for assessing change over time and the best practices to do so. Before we get into the details of using 360s as a measurement of growth over time, let's talk a little bit more just about 360s. In our most recent 360 feedback benchmarking study, we featured data from over 100 companies who use 360s, as well as historical data from another 400 companies. We asked which programs the companies use 360s in, and as you can see from the slides on the screen here, 35% of the respondents said that they were using 360s in leadership coaching, and 38%, pardon me, were using 360s in formal leadership education programs. More than half, 55% of the organizations we surveyed use 360s in more than one program. So 360s are broadly used across organizations in various forms for leadership development. So why is it? Why are 360s so commonly used in coaching and leadership development? Well, 360s are unique, and they're uniquely suited to support different programs because they bring leaders real-world feedback about how they're perceived and how that perception impacts their effectiveness. Understanding a leader's current behaviors, how his or her coworkers perceive them, and what the business environment is really critical to success. And an accurate understanding of how these factors have shifted from time one and time two keeps development relevant and focused. Companies do use 360s for different purposes. And when doing this, when designing a program where 360s are getting used, it is really critical, and one of the most important things is to define what the purpose of the program and the use of 360s is. 360s can be used as a predictor of leadership capability or as an assessment of past leadership performance. As we know, past behavior is predictive of future behavior. So the behavior that is observed in a 360 will predict how a leader is going to behave in the future. So 360s are really useful as a tool to help identify high potential employees, candidates for promotion into more senior roles, and to inform talent reviews and succession planning processes. 360s also provide valuable information about how a person has behaved on the job. So these data are useful in performance reviews, documentation, needs analysis for training and leadership development, and other analytical activities. Many of our clients do use 360s as a pre and post leadership development measure. That is, at time one, a leader completes a 360, receives feedback and coaching, uses the feedback to guide his or her professional development, and then completes another 360, say a year later, to assess his or her growth as a leader. This is a common sense approach. Measure what it is you want to measure, provide the feedback, or whatever the intervention is, and then measure it again, see if something changed. It makes a lot of sense. But when doing that with 360s for leadership development, you have to be really careful to do things the right way to ensure accurate and valid results. So a typical 360 will assess a leader on a number of leadership competencies, and each competency has a number of items within it. In most cases, the overall competency scores and individual item scores are reported in the 360 report. So today I'm going to spend time digging into this. Behavior change typically happens at the item level. So when the report is reporting off the competencies and the items, when we track behavior change over time, we typically see the items change, not the competencies. And that's because leaders are focused on one or two very specific targeted behaviors that impact their performance. And these target behaviors are too specific to be assessed at the competency level. Another important consideration when using 360s for time one and time two is the change in the organization and the people who work with the leader over time. These changes impact 360 scores. For example, raters selected to give a leader 360 feedback today may move into new roles, different parts of the company, or even leave the organization when a follow-up 360 is completed in another year or two. So the calibration between raters from time one to time two, the amount of time they've observed the leader, and the context of the leader's job all change quickly in an organization. There are also some important measurement realities that can hide change over time too. For example, if a leader is successful in one area of performance and they've moved the needle there and their item ratings go up, but maybe they fall behind in another behavior area, leadership behavior, when you average those items together, you're going to hide important information. You're going to have an overall score that doesn't change much, while digging deeper, you would find item scores that tell an important story. We are believers in using 360s to help assess leadership development over time. We also recognize it as a process that requires expertise, important planning, and really a lot of professional diligence. Therefore, there are some important considerations to keep in mind when using 360s to assess behavior change over time. We use an experienced 360 coach. This is a precise process. It does take experience and skill. So using a coach who is specially trained in providing 360 feedback and accurately assessing pre and post assessment results is really essential. Using 360 feedback to measure behavior change over time is a powerful tool that requires an expert's guidance. Interpret change over time at the item level, and then look for patterns between items, not at the competency level. So we're going to spend even more time digging into this today. Focusing on competency scores or even change on a single item level can hide important areas of behavior change and lead to incomplete and even false conclusions. We need to compare results using only the same raters. In time one and time two, different raters have different points of view and experiences with the leader. If you try to compare data from different raters, for example, if the leader has a new manager or different team members, comparable ratings from time one to time two will have significant intergroup rater error. Use a 360 feedback report that is specifically designed to be used for pre and post measure. Use a report that tracks who the raters are and identifies the raters who participated in both the time one and the time two assessment. And make sure that this assessment in the report still protect the rater's anonymity. So think about what makes a good coach. Coaches must be people who gain the trust of the leader and have the capability to engage individual leaders and be seen as credible. Ideally, coaches who are evaluating behavior change over time will have the statistical expertise to fully explain and interpret the results. They also need to demonstrate business acumen and have a deep understanding of what it takes to be an effective leader, and be able to help leaders gain the self-insight and manage leaders through different types of resistance to the feedback. So let's look at an example of a leader who received 360 feedback and took action to grow her leadership skills. This leader completed 360-degree feedback and learned that she needed to focus on listening more, especially listening more to her new staff members. She was open to the feedback and took her professional development seriously. The leader was effective and improved her listening skills, especially with her staff members. However, when she completed the 360, at time 2, her rating on the communication competency, which includes listening, barely changed. In fact, you can see from the numbers from time 1, time 2 at the communication competency, they actually went down a little bit. But when you dig deeper and examine the data at the item level, the item of listens to others attentively, you can see that her ratings went up a little bit. So by concentrating at the item level and knowing what she was working on, we were able to find that, yes, she did move the needle on this, but it moved a little. But then think about it. Her development plan was focused on improving her listening skills only with her direct reports, and especially the new members of her team. And keep in mind that this overall item rating of listening to others attentively includes ratings from her manager and her peers, as well as her direct reports. So when we dig into the data even further and look at the ratings on the item for listening to others attentively for her direct reports, we can see that she did move the needle significantly, a whole half a point with that group. But because it's averaged with the other raters of peers and boss, when we look at the overall score, we can see that that effect actually gets muted, and the data really aren't at the overall score telling the whole story. So we have to really dig deeper. Let's look at another example. We'll call this leader John. As you can see, he received a 3.5 on the competency of developing talent. But when you look closer and look at the items, you can see that there's a relatively low score on the removes and develops poor performers. And when we looked at the comments for this, he had a comment from his boss that says he needs to take action on poor performance of the team member we have discussed. So combining the quantitative data with the feedback from the open comments, we really get an idea of a specific development need that he needs to take appropriate action to remove or develop poor performers. So assume John dedicates himself to improving the specific leadership behavior. In a follow-up 360 survey, you would expect that his ratings on the item of remove or develop poor performers would improve. And in fact, it does. John got the feedback and he immediately took action, and he terminated the employee. And you can see, because he took the action of removing a poor performer, his ratings on the item in time 2 went up from a 1.7 to 3.4. They doubled. But even with that, the overall competency score barely moved. So this is illustrating again that major change can be hidden by the averaging and aggregation of data. But there's more data here. There's more to the story. When you look at the data above, the increase from time 1 to time 2 on removes or develops poor performance is impressive. But without understanding the context behind it, may give us a false or incomplete conclusion. In this case, John did remove the poor performer that was responsible for the low score. But his poor handling of the situation negatively affected other items within this competency on the time 2 report. and did not reflect well in the organization. So like I said, in response to the initial feedback, John promptly fired the employee in question, but he made no attempt to develop the individual or improve his performance, essentially ignoring the other important leadership behaviors within the development talent competency. So his colleagues noticed this, that he had eliminated a poor performer, but they also noticed that he had not actually improved his ability to hold other people accountable for the development or provide timely, constructive performance feedback. These insights into the real story behind John's scores and his leadership performance on developing talent will really only be revealed if his feedback from time 1 to time 2 is supported by an experienced and thoughtful coach who asks the probing questions and knows how to dig into the data. So clearly, only a mechanical look at a comparison in a small set of items and how they've changed from time 1 to time 2 without the interpretation of a skilled coach is not recommended. But when a professional coach is involved, 360 feedback can be a powerful tool to understand leadership behavior over time. As I mentioned earlier, organizations change over time. It is likely that the raters who provided leader feedback in 360 a year ago will not all be the same if we want to give the leader feedback again today. The reliability and validity of time 1 and time 2 comparisons are greater if you have the ability to compare time 1 and time 2 ratings from the exact same raters only. This reduces inter-rater error over time and provides a more reliable data set and a longitudinal narrative for the leader and his or her coach. Because assessing leadership development over time is important, and because 360-degree feedback can be a useful tool to assess development and support ongoing leadership growth, we have developed a special report that addresses the challenges we have discussed and supports the use of 360s as a tool to assess leadership development over time. We call this report our trending report. And with this report, we combine the data from the 2 reports, from the time 1 and the time 2 report. We analyze the percentage of overlap in raters, and we can configure the report in different ways to meet specific client needs, where we can report out the overall time 1 and time 2, or the ratings from the overlap in the raters to see what has changed. Here we provide a more detailed view of who all the raters are, including the raters that overlap from time 1 to time 2. It's important to note that although we identify who is giving feedback, we do not violate the rater's anonymity. All the data are reported at the rater group and overall level, and this protects each individual's anonymity, while it still gives the leader who's receiving the feedback clear, specific, and accurate data. In our report, we do report out the competencies from time 1 and time 2. And not surprisingly, as we've talked about earlier, the competency scores don't change that much from time 1 to time 2. As I said, there are multiple ways we can configure the report to meet specific client needs. Here you see the report configuration that displays the item scores and the change score over time, making it easy for the coach and the leader to see where the leader's scores have gone up and where they've gone down. Using a report that is specifically designed to assess change over time gives the leader and the coach a clear view of the data that leads to more complete and meaningful feedback and professional development. The clear reporting of data helps bring the real story to life and minimizes the challenge for comparing time 1 and time 2 results. So we've covered a lot of technical ground on the benefits and challenges of using 360s as an assessment of individual leadership development over time. To summarize, focus on the item level, not the competency level, when assessing change over time. As with any 360, look for patterns within the data, across items, and in the rater comments. Minimize rater group error by comparing the ratings from the same raters in time 1 and time 2 to develop a data set that is more reliable and valid. And very importantly, provide the leader with an experienced coach to support accurate and complete interpretation of the data. So we're going to be sending a white paper out to everybody who's come to the webinar today that digs into this more as a follow-up to this webinar. One thing we haven't talked about today is using 360s to assess leadership development program effectiveness over time. So not at the individual level, but at the programmatic level. And evaluating the positive impact of leadership development across the organization is somewhat of a holy grail for leadership development departments. Our take on it is that 360s can be useful as a part of program evaluation. There are a lot of challenges in doing program evaluation across the organization. You've seen all the moving variables when you're looking at an individual, and then you multiply that by the complexity of the organization and the number of people. The data are there, but it does take a lot of time to dig into it and understand what it really means. This means a lot of consulting hours, and it means a lot of expense. But there are some alternative approaches, rather than digging into the data like that, that will provide effective assessment of a leadership development program's impact. We're not going to talk about that in detail today, but we are going to dig in. We will provide a future webinar and information looking at programmatic evaluation. Thanks so much for your time today. Now we're going to open up the conversation for questions.
Hi, Charles. Yes, we did have some great questions. The first is, do you have any tips on how to ensure that leaders use the training and development they've been offered?
It's a great question. I think there has to be a what's in it for them. And I think especially if you're launching a program that is about time one and time two, making sure that the leader knows there's going to be a time two. Make sure that they know that their development plan that comes out of the first 360 and feedback and coaching will be assessed. Did they move the needle on it when they take that second 360 a year or two down the road? It's also working with a coach who helps them really build their self-awareness and understand what the data mean, and take accountability and understand that they can move the needle.
Okay, so the next question is, how can we change leaders' mindset from one of process and procedure to something more oriented towards growth and innovation?
Oh, that's great. I'll assume process and procedure, kind of what you're talking about there is the having leaders go from being tactical to being more innovative and strategic in how they approach their role as a leader, and leading the part of the company that they're responsible for. We see this a lot in organizations. When you're trying to assess and develop a specific leadership behavior, you need to make sure that that's part of the plan up front, and that your content in a 360 includes those items. So if you're asking, if you want to have more innovative leaders, you need to have items that ask about innovation and showing that on the job. And I think also, as you are communicating the purpose of the 360, tying that to your broader strategic HR and organizational vision and mission. So I mean, by asking the right questions, giving them feedback on it, and helping them be self-accountable to their development, you can target those specific behaviors.
Okay, great. Thank you. So our last question is there a best way to debrief results of a 360?
Yes. The first, talking about what not to do when debriefing 360. It happens often, but the big what not to do is to jump right into the data. The coach and the participant need to show up to the coaching session prepared. They need to have read the data and understand what's in the report. As a coach, before you jump into the report and the data, you need to make sure you understand where the leader is. Have they had bad experiences with a 360 in the past? Asking them what they want to get out of it beyond creating a development plan. If you don't know the leader, making sure you understand uh, his or her work background. What did they do before their current role? What's their current role? And what are their aspirations? Digging into all of that about the person up front before you even get into the data is going to really help the person who's getting the feedback understand that it's about them and it's for them, and that as a coach, you're there to help them develop. And then I also always ask, what are your takeaways when you read through the data? Um, a lot of times they get it. They've seen the data, especially at the time one, and that shortens the amount of time we spend actually digging into the report, and we spend more time on kind of the so what of what's the providing some coaching, defining some really good targeted development goals.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that's all the questions we have for today, so we'll stop there. If you have questions that you'd like to speak to us about individually, you can give us a call at 510-463-0333 and visit our website at 3dgroup.net. So our next webinar is scheduled for September 13th. 3D Group President Dale Rose will be joining us and sharing insights from one of his chapters in the soon-to-be-released Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. He'll be discussing 360 feedback versus some alternative forms of feedback and how each of them enables change. So we hope you'll join us then. Thank you again, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.